They are, as you say, connoisseurs of power and clearly much longer-term strategic thinkers. But also, I think a second long-term consequence is, what does all of this mean for America's position, soft power, favorability in the world relative to China's? And there's a very striking chart that I just want to show you, which I thought is really stunning. This is a opinion poll of the public in 42 countries. It's dramatic. For those of you listening, the US favorability plunges and China's is gradually rising. But are you struck by the scale of that shift?
I really am, yeah.
大家好，欢迎来到本期视频。今天这场对话来自经济学人，参与对谈的3位嘉宾正好是经济学人的顶级智囊团。爱特华·卡尔，经济学人副主编，他是经济学人的2号人物，长期掌舵杂志的全球报道方向，尤其专注于大国竞争和国际秩序的深层变迁。戴维·伦尼，地缘政治编辑，茶观的专栏主笔，他的专栏专门解读中国政治与社会的生存逻辑。他也是极少数能深入中南海外围观察，与政策研究者建立长期对话关系的西方记者之一。亚当·罗伯茨，外交事务编辑，统筹全球冲突、外交与安全报道。他的足迹遍布中东、东南亚与华盛顿，擅长将战场的硝烟与外交博弈编织成一幅完整的权力背景图。这3个高管坐在一起谈论中国，他们会讨论什么呢？好，话不多说，我们来看正片吧。
One of the things that I'm struck by is, President Xi's focus on chokeholds, which he clearly had in terms of his own focus on rare earths. And he was very determined to ensure that China had something with which to push against the US tariff imposition a year ago. The war in Iran has shown that Iran too understands chokeholds and has very, very effectively used its geographic leverage over the Strait of Hormuz. Do you think that logic will induce China going forward to keep thinking about chokeholds? David?
They're connoisseurs of power. So, they're very impressed by the military AI. They're going to have some serious thinking on their side about how far ahead America is on that. So they're not kind of cheering about what's happening. They're watching it very carefully. On the chokeholds, one of my big fears is that Donald Trump is a connoisseur of the chokeholds of his youth. He's obsessed with oil and fossil fuels, the things that made you powerful in the 1980s. The Chinese are looking for the next chokehold. So several times people said, yes, we used the control of our rare earth mineral sort of supply routes last year to really induce kind of panic in America and the rest of the world. But now America is going to get us, is going to do whatever it takes to break that chokehold. So we need to think of the next chokehold. And they would list, pharmaceutical precursors, other chemicals. They are looking for leverage all the time. They are connoisseurs of power. But I think one other thing that came up again and again is, I've watched them, I've listened to them tracking Trump since the first term when I was in Beijing and then through into the second term. They currently think of him as you say, chaotic and difficult to deal with, but also a tremendous opportunity because they say, and I do believe them because I always, the more cynical they are, the more truthful I think they're being because they are exceedingly cynical, is he is the least hawkish person in Washington they know. He is more willing to let China buy high-end American chips, to invest in America, that his transactional, selfish, me-first instincts are an opportunity for China. One of the things we heard was, if this Iran war weakens him too much, that's actually bad for us. Because if he's really weak in Washington, then that foreign policy blob, the hawks waiting in the wings, they get maybe more power. So they like dealing with this chaotic, selfish, transactional, not very hawkish Donald Trump.
Interesting. So the weakness of Donald Trump would lead not to a more traditional MAGA Republican, but to the sort of triumph of the hawks.
Yeah, Marco Rubio gets more power. That's their nightmare.
That's of course they really do think 3 steps ahead. Part of this, chokeholds is one. So raw power, and they are, as you say, connoisseurs of power, and clearly much longer term strategic thinkers. To wit, Napoleon being, quoted so often to you. But also, I think a second long-term consequence is, what does all of this mean for America's position, soft power, favorability in the world relative to China's? And there's a very striking chart that I just want to show you, which I thought is really stunning. This is a opinion poll of the public in 42 countries. It's dramatic. For those of you listening, the US favorability plunges and China's is gradually rising. Ed, I guess one shouldn't be surprised by this, but are you struck by the scale of that shift?
I really am, yeah. And it started, I guess it started around in 2024. So is that around election time, do you think?
November 2024.
Yeah.
Trump.
Yeah.
So there's a big dip, goes down, and then it starts to recover. Actually, surprisingly, does sort of a bit of a dip in Liberation Day in April. But then you see the beginning of this year, both Venezuela first, I think, and then Iran, these precipitous falls from +5 average to -15. And it's telling you that people are threatened and very uncomfortable by the idea of a US that is sort of in a revolutionary sense tearing up the sort of world that it had presided over.
And this is, I wondered, Adam, whether the view of China is not necessarily affection, but perhaps more, at least it's predictable.
I think that's right. I spent some time just before being in China in Singapore and talking to people there, where there were people from the rest of Asia at our summits as well. And the clear message we got from those in Southeast Asia and elsewhere is that China is at least a known quantity. Yes, it can be a threat. Yes, it can be a bully in the region, but there are going to be times when you want to work with them, and it's getting more and more rational to work with them. So we've seen the Philippines, for example, agreeing now to do a joint exploration for oil and gas in the South China Sea as they talk about normalizing relations with China. I think you'll see more of that because it makes more sense now.
All of this is sort of predicated on our, I think, subtext of this conversation, which is that this has been a sort of misguided, hubristic catastrophe for the US and will therefore have negative long-term consequences. But I do just want to prod you a bit by asking you a question that Kaya Newhagen asks, which is, America recovered from Iraq and Afghanistan. What makes Beijing so confident this time is different?
Well, I agree to the extent that America has enormous powers of recovery and reinvention. And, that is the fundamental strength of a democracy. It also has capital markets that are able to deploy resources unlike any other in the world. And we're seeing that with AI, which could also become a source of enormous American power. So I do think there's a world in which this revolutionary, destructive movement sets everybody else back, ultimately including China. Because it does, like any other country, even as big as it is, it will be affected by what's happening externally. There is a world in which, in this upheaval and chaos, America is able to thrive. I don't think that's the most likely outcome. The most likely outcome is that America suffers too, and it sees, as its alliances fall apart, it sees its power decline. But it is a world that we need to be aware of.
But let's assume that happens, and America is this revolutionary power, smashing things up, declining. David, what strikes me in this is that I see no movement at all, and reinforced by this conversation, from China to do anything other than cynically look out for itself.
100%.
No desire to step in any kind of leadership role.
100%. And I think that's a fascinating, either there's a totally optimistic view that America has an election, recovers and comes back as the kind of the America we know and love, or we go to something much more kind of law of the jungle and America's just this beast kind of rampaging around. Either way, that's a big problem for China because China has been a total free rider. It's not wrong when Donald Trump says China uses the Strait of Hormuz and America doesn't really depend on oil through the Strait of Hormuz. That kind of selfishness that China pitches to others as the reason you can rely and depend on China. One of the sort of interesting questions that I tried to kind of push them on, and I didn't get a great answer, was, isn't there a version of disorder and disruption and chaos that means you have to start doing more? You have been such free riders on that American security order. And some of the shrewdest, sort of worldliest scholars who I've known for some years, they say, yes, that is a conversation we need to have. But, our system moves really slowly. It's really cautious. And I think that's one of the things you hear so often in Beijing, that Xi Jinping and the leadership, they like their current plan. They don't want to change. And so for all of their talk about, changes unseen in 100 years, they're actually kind of status quo. They don't really want to adapt to their own rhetoric.
The thing I really want to emphasize here, though, is that in a rapidly changing world where the world we knew is falling apart, that's a world that China should be worried about. And it's a bit of a blind spot, I think. There is an awareness there that actually to have these new productive forces, to develop these new industries, you need stable trade, you need to be able to import vital commodities, you need predictability, you need to be able to finance things. There is that awareness, but the system is very, very uncomfortable despite it being created by revolutionary change, is very, very uncomfortable by rapid change.
And that kind of free riding on the existing system and lack of focus on what kind of role China would need to play in a, more centrifugal, dysfunctional system is probably a long-term weakness, as you say.
好了，本期视频就到这里了，欢迎大家在评论区理性交流和补充。另外，制作视频不易，如果您觉得做得不错，感谢您动动手指，一键3连。如果您有更多的想法或建议，也可以在评论区告诉我，我都会看见。我们下期见。